Most people who cross paths with a serial killer never get the chance to tell anyone about it. That's what makes tonight's three stories different, and in some ways, even harder to sit with. These aren't accounts pieced together after the fact from evidence and speculation. These are the stories of people who looked their attacker in the eye, fought back, and lived, and whose survival directly changed the outcome of some of the most notorious criminal cases in American history. Tonight, an 18-year-old who escaped a fake police officer's Volkswagen and became the key witness who finally put Ted Bundy behind bars. A man who spent 4 terrifying hours handcuffed inside Jeffrey Dahmer's apartment before making a desperate escape that ended one of the most horrifying killing sprees in American history. And a 15-year-old girl who survived an attack so brutal it changed California law, and who decades later willingly faced her attacker one final time. Every detail in this video comes from court records, trial testimony, and the survivors' own accounts. This is not easy material, but it's real, and these three people lived through it. Let's get into it. Story 1. The girl who got away. By the fall of 1974, Ted Bundy had already killed a number of young women across Washington and Oregon, though almost nobody knew it yet. He developed a method that worked with disturbing consistency. Approach a young woman, present himself as harmless or even helpful, and get her to willingly go somewhere alone with him. On November 8, 1974, he brought that same method to Salt Lake City, Utah, and it very nearly worked one more time. Carol DaRonch was 18 years old, a recent high school graduate working as a telephone operator, and by her own description, an extremely shy person who genuinely wanted to be helpful to others. A trait she would later come to believe that Bundy had specifically learned to recognize and exploit in his victims. That evening, she was browsing a bookstore inside the Fashion Place Mall in Murray, Utah, when a man approached her, introduced himself as Officer Roseland, and told her that someone had attempted to break into her car, a maroon 1974 Camaro she'd only recently bought and was still proud of. DaRonch went out to check the vehicle with him. Nothing appeared to be missing or damaged, but the man, who was of course Ted Bundy, told her she needed to come to the police station to file a report and possibly identify a suspect. He showed her a badge. It was enough. Despite finding it slightly odd that an officer would be driving an unmarked Volkswagen Beetle rather than a police vehicle, DaRonch convinced herself he might simply be undercover and got in. It's worth pausing on exactly how ordinary this all felt to her in the moment. She wasn't reckless. She wasn't naive in any way that stands out from how any 18-year-old might have reacted to a man presenting a badge and a plausible story in a well-lit, crowded shopping mall. That, more than anything else, is what made Bundy so effective and so terrifying. His victims' instincts weren't failing them. He had simply built a version of normalcy specifically designed to walk straight through those instincts unchallenged. Only a few minutes into the drive, DaRonch grew increasingly uneasy. Bundy wasn't heading towards the police station. He pulled the Volkswagen over near an elementary school and, in a sudden violent shift, grabbed her arm and attempted to handcuff her. He only managed to close the cuff around one wrist before she began fighting back with everything she had. In the chaos, Bundy pulled out a small crowbar and tried to strike her with it. DaRonch kept fighting, found the door handle, and threw herself out of the moving vehicle and into the street, one handcuff still dangling from her wrist. She ran into the middle of Fashion Boulevard, flagging down a passing car. The drivers and his wife picked her up, shaken and injured, and got her to safety. Bundy, having lost his intended victim, simply drove off. What happened next is the detail that still unsettles people who studied this case. Enraged and, according to his own later confessions, unable to simply let the night end in failure, Bundy went on to abduct 17-year-old Deborah Kent just hours later from a high school where she'd stepped out during intermission at a school play to pick up her younger brother. She was never seen alive again. Her remains weren't recovered until 2015, more than 4 decades later. When DaRonch heard the news of another young woman's disappearance that same night, in the same area, she immediately understood the connection and went straight to the police. At the time, investigators in Utah were already quietly working to connect a string of disappearances that fall, and detectives in Seattle were separately hunting for a suspect connected to several other missing women. A man some witnesses had heard referred to only by the first name Ted. DaRonch's account, detailed, specific, and delivered by someone who had survived the encounter face to face, gave Utah investigators their first genuinely strong lead. A composite sketch, a description of the tan Volkswagen, and a clear account of his specific method. Nearly a year later, in August of 1975, a Utah patrol officer pulled over a suspicious Volkswagen, driving erratically through his patrol area late at night. Inside, he found a crowbar, handcuffs, a ski mask, and other tools that matched almost exactly what DaRonch had described from her own attack. The driver was Ted Bundy. DaRonch identified him in a police lineup that October. In February of 1976, she became the key witness in his trial for aggravated kidnapping, testifying in detail, despite an aggressive cross-examination from Bundy's defense attorney designed to pick apart her memory of the vehicle and the badge. She held firm, famously telling the court she would never forget his face. Bundy was convicted and sentenced to 1 to 15 years in prison. A conviction that, crucially, kept him in custody long enough for investigators in multiple states to begin building the far larger case against him for a string of murders. DaRonch's involvement in the case didn't end there. She later traveled to Aspen, Colorado, to testify in a separate murder trial, where Bundy, acting as his own defense attorney by that point, was allowed to personally cross-examine the same woman he had once tried to abduct and kill. She testified once more at his 1979 pre-sentencing hearing in Florida, after his eventual conviction for the murders of 2 Florida State University sorority sisters. Bundy was ultimately executed in January of 1989 after confessing on death row to killing at least 30 people, though investigators believe the true number is almost certainly higher. Carol DaRonch has said in interviews that surviving Bundy still feels, even decades later, genuinely hard to believe. She went on to earn a business degree, largely avoided the media spotlight for years, and eventually agreed to share her story again in interviews and documentaries. In her words, because if it could help even one other person, it was worth reliving. What strikes people most about her account isn't just that she survived, it's how directly her survival and her insistence on testifying not once but 3 separate times became the thread that helped unravel one of the most extensive serial murder cases in American history. Story 2. 4 hours in the apartment. By the summer of 1991, Jeffrey Dahmer had already murdered at least 16 men and boys in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, over a span of 13 years. It was that single decision, inviting the police into his own apartment, that ended his 13-year killing spree in a matter of minutes. While searching for the key, one of the officers noticed a knife matching Edwards' description and then opened a drawer containing more than 70 Polaroid photographs depicting nude and dismembered bodies in various stages of decomposition. A further search turned up a human head inside the refrigerator and additional remains inside the freezer. Dahmer was arrested on the spot. He would go on to confess to murdering 17 people between 1978 and 1991, describing in graphic detail how he drugged, strangled, and dismembered his victims and, in several cases, consumed parts of their remains. He was convicted in 1992 and sentenced to 15 consecutive life terms. Tracy Edwards testified against Dahmer at his trial, recounting the 4 hours he'd spent handcuffed in that apartment and the moment Dahmer told him he planned to eat his heart. His testimony was widely credited as a critical piece of the case that helped secure Dahmer's conviction. And at the time, Edwards was publicly hailed as something close to a hero. The man whose escape had single-handedly ended one of the most horrifying serial murder cases in American history. What makes Edwards' story especially difficult, beyond the 4 hours themselves, is what came after. According to his own attorney, Edwards never sought any formal psychological treatment for what he'd survived, choosing instead, in his lawyer's words, to self-medicate rather than confront it directly. In the years following the trial, Edwards struggled significantly with homelessness, substance use, and repeated legal trouble, including a conviction years later connected to the death of another homeless man during an altercation, for which Edwards ultimately pleaded guilty to a lesser charge and served roughly a year and a half in prison. His attorney later described him simply as someone who had never fully been able to put the pieces of his life back together after that single night. A man who had survived the encounter itself, but who spent the rest of his life still carrying it. It's a detail that adds a difficult but important layer to the story. Surviving an encounter with a serial killer isn't the end of the story for the people who live through it. For Tracy Edwards, in particular, it was, by his own attorney's account, the beginning of a much longer and much harder second ordeal that never really ended. Story 3. The Girl in the Canyon. In September of 1978, Mary Vincent was 15 years old, hitchhiking her way south through California to visit her grandfather. Hitchhiking, unusual as it may sound today, was still a fairly ordinary way for young people to travel in the 1970s, and Vincent, an artistic, dance-loving teenager, caught up in the aftermath of her parents' divorce, had been getting around this way for some time. On September 29th, standing on the roadside with 2 other hitchhikers, a van pulled over, driven by a 50-year-old man named Lawrence Singleton, a merchant seaman with a previous conviction for contributing to the delinquency of a minor and a long history of heavy drinking. Singleton told the group he only had room for one passenger. The two other hitchhikers pulled Vincent aside and told her directly that they didn't think she should get in. Exhausted from the road and against her own better judgment, she climbed into the van anyway. For a while, the ride seemed completely normal. But as Vincent grew drowsy and eventually fell asleep, Singleton changed course, heading away from the direction she needed to go. When she woke and realized what was happening, she found a sharp object inside the van and confronted him, demanding he turn the vehicle around. He complied, seemingly calm, claiming he had simply made an honest mistake, and then pulled over shortly afterward, telling her he needed to use the bathroom. It was in reality a moment of calculated deception. Singleton attacked her with a sledgehammer, knocking her unconscious, then drove her to an isolated, desolate stretch of terrain known as Del Puerto Canyon. Over the following hours, he raped her repeatedly and held her captive through the night. In the morning, in an act of almost incomprehensible cruelty, apparently intended to prevent her from ever being identified, Singleton used a hatchet to cut off both of Mary Vincent's forearms. He left her, still alive, in a concrete drainage culvert in the canyon, assuming she would bleed to death before anyone ever found her. She didn't, despite catastrophic blood loss, severe trauma, and the loss of both forearms. 15-year-old Mary Vincent got herself up and walked roughly 3 miles out of the canyon on her own, eventually reaching a highway where she was spotted and rushed to a hospital. Doctors would later say her survival, given the extent of her injuries and blood loss, was close to medically inexplicable. At the hospital, despite everything she had just endured, Vincent gave police an extraordinarily detailed description of her attacker. She later said she deliberately described him with the level of precision you'd use describing someone to a person who was blind, determined to make absolutely certain investigators could identify him. About a week later, one of Singleton's own neighbors recognized a police sketch built from her description and reported him. Just 6 months after the attack, Mary Vincent sat in a courtroom wearing 2 prosthetic arms and testified directly against Lawrence Singleton, describing in detail everything he had done to her. Singleton was convicted of attempted murder, rape, and a string of related sexual assault charges. But due to sentencing laws in California at the time, which capped even the most extreme, violent sexual offenses at a maximum of 14 years. That was the absolute ceiling of punishment available to the court, regardless of the severity of what he had done. He was sentenced to the maximum 14 years and released after serving just over 8 years on the grounds of good behavior. The public reaction to his early release was immediate and furious. Several California communities formally refused to allow Singleton to live within their borders, and he was ultimately forced to spend his entire parole period living in a trailer parked on the grounds of San Quentin State Prison itself, permitted to leave only a few times a week for basic errands. His case became so notorious that California lawmakers drafted new legislation directly in response to it, informally known as the Singleton Bill, which raised the minimum sentence for crimes involving torture to 25 years, specifically to prevent another case like his from ending in such a brief prison term. it wasn't enough to stop him from killing again. In 1997, nearly 2 decades after attacking Mary Vincent, Lawrence Singleton murdered a 31-year-old mother of 3 named Roxanne Hayes in Florida. He was arrested at the scene, covered in blood, after a neighbor called 911. When his murder trial began, Mary Vincent, now an adult, decades removed from the attack that had already taken her arms, chose to fly across the country and testify against him one final time, determined to help ensure he would never again have the chance to hurt anyone else. On the stand, she described what he had done to her in stark, unflinching terms: that he raped her, that he cut off her arms with a hatchet, and that he left her to die. Singleton was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. He spent the following years on death row before eventually dying of cancer in 2001 at age 74. In the years since, Mary Vincent has become an artist, a mother, and a victim's advocate, founding an organization to support other survivors of violent crime and testifying before Congress in support of federal legislation aimed at keeping violent offenders off the streets. Her survival, first of the attack itself and later of her own choice to face her attacker in court not once but twice, remains one of the most extraordinary true accounts of resilience connected to any serial predator case in American history. 3 survivors, 3 completely different encounters, decades apart, with 3 men who each killed repeatedly and would very likely have kept killing if not for a single decision each of these 3 people made in their most desperate moment. DaRonch fighting her way out of a moving car, Edwards waiting for the exact right second to strike back, and Vincent refusing to simply lie down and die in that canyon. What ties all 3 of these stories together is a difficult but important truth about how many of history's most notorious serial killers were actually stopped. It wasn't always brilliant detective work or forensic breakthroughs that ended these killing sprees. In each of these 3 cases, it was first and foremost an ordinary person's split-second decision to fight, to run, or to simply refuse to die. A decision that not only saved their own life, but directly led to the arrest, conviction, or continued imprisonment of a man who would almost certainly have gone on to kill again. It's worth remembering, too, that survival wasn't the end of any of these 3 stories. Carol DaRonch spent years living with the knowledge of exactly how close she'd come. Tracy Edwards, by his own attorney's account, never fully recovered from those 4 hours. And Mary Vincent rebuilt an entire life and career around turning her own worst moment into something that could protect other people. Surviving a serial killer, as all 3 of these stories make clear, isn't a single moment of triumph. It's a burden these 3 people have carried in very different ways for the rest of their lives.